Welcome back. Time now to discuss the week in politics. Joining me live is Gideon Rosner from the Institute of Public Affairs and Ebony Bennett from the Australian Institute. Thank you for joining me, guys.
Thank you.
To be here.
First up, we'll go with the Canberra bubble. Two senior federal government ministers in the spotlight, an expose slated as what was meant to be triggering the Bonk ban. There's been a lot of discussion, I know, about whether or not this was actually in the public interest, but I'm more interested in what you make of the government's response to it. We'll begin with you, Gideon.
Well, look, the government obviously has a headache on its hands. Thank God Joel Fitzgibbon knocked it out of the headlines from the government's perspective, I suppose. But, Andrew, I'm just so glad we have the ABC to be our moral guardians and tell us what is appropriate and what isn't. Look, you know, I think I'm really bothered by the puritanical nature of this. No, it's not a great idea to sleep with your staff, and it's not a good look. But everybody's marriage is different. People are complex, and the human condition is complex. But, you know, I guess, you know, if we're in a society now where we're being told we can't shake hands, we can't hug, we can't get close to each other, the human contact is evil, I guess it's a pretty small step to say we can't have sex either. So well done to the ABC on a wonderful piece of journalism and proving, as always, that it's our trusted national broadcaster.
Well, Gideon, I guess the difference here, though, is these are two politicians who have continually promoted family values, both voted against
absolutely. No arguments there. Yeah, no. I take that point, but all the same, I mean, that was a small part of it. The issue was making out that any and all office romances, and I don't know the full story behind these situations, are a result of some sort of power imbalance. As I said, this is to me a new Victorian prudery and a very puritanical development in our politics. And Australians are very, very sick of being told what to do in a range of areas, and I don't think this will make that case any easier.
Now, Ebony, we saw that the government was obviously quick to try and downplay this and get it out of the spotlight before, as Gideon said, Joel Fitzgibbon helped them with that. But I'll particularly focus on that news conference we saw where he was beside Anne Ruston. There was a question directed to her. Scott Morrison was quick to jump in. Probably wasn't the best of looks for the Prime Minister.
No, absolutely. But I thought it was also interesting that Scott Morrison seemed more concerned about the name Bonk ban than he was about any of the allegations about the type of behaviour that was displayed or on display in Four Corners. And the fact is, I think Samantha Maiden nailed it this morning on Insiders. There's a double standard at play here, where ministers like Alan Tudge can put out a statement and that's the end of the situation, whereas someone like Emma Hussar on the backbench was basically hounded out of Parliament for similar allegations. And what we're talking about here is, you know, I happen to agree that I don't think the Bonk ban is necessarily the best way to address this, but at least it's trying to address something here is going wrong. And frankly, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about consensual sexual relationships or non-consensual ones involving sexual harassment or worse. The fact is, men engage in this behaviour and face zero consequences, and women's careers are ruined time and again. Doesn't matter what side of politics, and it doesn't matter whether it's a consensual relationship.
I'm standing down from the front bench. Should Albanese be listening to him or should he be worried about it?
Look, I think what's becoming clear the further we get into the Albo leadership is that Bill Shorten was a lousy alternative Prime Minister through, you know, no fault of his own through the policies he was lumped with, but he was a good leader. He managed to keep the party together. But as I said, a consequence of that was that he had to take a very extreme policy platform to the election. Anthony Albanese is obviously losing control of two very, very different sides of the Labor Party, and he has to be worried because if Bill Shorten manages to cast himself as bomber jacket Bill, centrist Bill, you know, bringing the country together Bill, not, you know, Kmart selling McManus Bill that we saw at the last election, then we might actually see Labor get very, very competitive and Scott Morrison might find himself being undercut. Basically, there's a big constituency of Australians now who know what it's like to shut down the economy for the sake of the coronavirus and won't be particularly enamoured by the fact that a lot of people are suggesting that we make similar changes to our economy for the sake of theories of climate change. So, yeah, I think there's a lot that Albo needs to be worried about, but also, frankly, Scott Morrison, because Labor, if Joel Fitzgibbon is, you know, it keeps going, they could be on a winner here.
Ebony, your take?
I completely disagree with all of that. Basically, you know, Joel Fitzgibbon has really put the focus on him this week when we should be talking about coal workers in the Hunter and elsewhere around the country, because the coal is in decline, whether or not you're talking about coal burning power stations or coal mining. The world is moving to address climate change, and Australia basically faces two options. We can go down the route that Germany chose, where it looks to the future, sees that the industry is in decline, and unions, workers, business and government come together, and they were able to transition away from coal with no forced redundancies. This is something the CFMEU pointed out this week. Or on the other hand, we could go down the route of America, where we just stick our head in the sand, ignore it, and we'll end up with entrenched poverty in the Hunter Valley in the same way that there's now entrenched poverty in Appalachia. Australia's biggest coal customers, Japan, the Philippines, China, South Korea, several of those have net zero by 2050 emissions reduction targets. China's going to do that by 2060, be carbon neutral. The Philippines is no longer going to be building new coal-fired power stations. And here in Australia, the ANZ recently announced it's no longer lending to coal projects. So this is the way that the economics of coal is going, and it's no good to just ignore it. And frankly, Joel Fitzgibbon is immaterial to this debate. What we need to be talking about is how we're going to help coal workers transition, because that's the way the economics is heading. And coal workers aren't stupid. They'll know that this is what's coming down the line. The decision we have to make is whether or not we're going to accept this reality and work and help them, or we're just going to ignore it and let them be, left behind.
Now, turning to the national anthem, it's NAIDOC week. We had the New South Wales Premier coming out asking that the national anthem change one line from young and free to one and free to better reflect our Indigenous history. It's been supported by Albanese, Ken Wyatt. The PM's office says no plans, though. Gideon, would have this been a simple step towards better unity?
No, it wouldn't have. It would have been yet another piece of symbolism that would have been superseded by some other demand later on down the track. Look, I think we make a mistake when we talk about the national anthem, every single piece of it, literally. I mean, who said that an anthem has to be a complete mission statement that's supposed to literally embody everything, every single value the country stands for? The Star-Spangled Banner, the American anthem, is one of the best anthems in the world, and that's just a poem, basically, about an obscure battle in the War of 1812. These things are worth more than the sum of their parts. They get the meaning that we have that we give them over time. And look, again, I make the point, we in the 90s we had reconciliation marches, in the 2000s we had the national apology, we have a perennial debate over Australia Day. Now, some of these things are great and cathartic and are genuinely good, and some aren't, but I think they distract from very real problems that Indigenous communities have in remote communities, and this will not do anything to address those. We should be talking about, native title reform to allow Indigenous people to make better use of their land. We should be talking about ways that we can get jobs into remote communities and end welfare dependency. We should be talking, quite frankly, about high rates of domestic violence and things like that, not to blame those communities or to vilify them or anything else, but to actually understand that we have our own fellow Australians, indeed our first Australians, living in third world conditions in a first world country. And frankly, that is the biggest disgrace in the country right now. It is an absolute national shame. And talking about the anthem, it might be a lovely distraction, but there are much bigger things to talk about. And I just don't have the energy to litigate things like this.
Ebony, we obviously saw the anthem change in 1984 somewhat. Is changing it a step, or is it, as Gideon says, a distraction from those real issues, those other bigger issues that need to be sorted?
Yeah, look, I agree with Gideon in large part, but I guess I've got a different list of things. We've got a couple of years on from the Uluru Statement from the Heart. There's no voice to Parliament, no treaty. There's no truth-telling commission or body that's been organised. The government rejected most of those requests. We've seen this week the government refused to even fly the Aboriginal flag in the Senate during NAIDOC week. The Morrison government is intending to extend the cashless debit card, which is frankly a racist policy targeted at Aboriginal Australians to control how they spend their money. We could go on. We've done nothing about Aboriginal over-policing and over-incarceration or Aboriginal deaths in custody. So while I'm not necessarily opposed to changing a word in the national anthem, to say that we are one and free, I'm not sure that that's the case. There's lots of Aboriginal people in Australia who aren't free. And as far as being one, I mean, it was just a few months ago that Rio Tinto destroyed 65,000 years of Aboriginal heritage at Juukan Caves, and just a couple of weeks since the Victorian government cut down the sacred directions tree on Djab land in Victoria for a highway. So really, I think until we start addressing some of those bigger problems, changing the national anthem, I think, is small beer by comparison.
Ebony Bennett, Gideon Rosner, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Ebony.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
Wages are growing at their slower, sustained pace.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.